When someone starts talking about body fat and the fat that you can pinch or jiggle, or the fat that we might have viscerally in that visceral space, the visceral fat, that's all white fat. And then we have throughout our thoracic cavity, we have little depots of brown fat. Now, all human adults have various amounts of this. And then this brown fat is what's creating the heat and using the glucose especially to create heat. So insulin doesn't like wasting energy. Insulin wants the body to store, and so it's going to make brown fat shut off. It's going to come to the brown fat, bind to insulin receptors, and tell the brown fat, slow down uncoupling, start acting more like white fat. So slow everything down. And sure enough, we found that when you have brown fat cells that are exposed to insulin, their metabolic rate will go down by about half.
Wow.
Now, in contrast, we have all the subcutaneous fat that I mentioned, the jiggly fat that's right beneath our skin, that has the capacity to act like brown fat, this process known as beiging, where it doesn't actually become brown fat, but it acts like it.
Hey friends, Mike with High Intensity Health. Thanks for tuning back into another video. I'm very excited today to be here with Dr. Ben Bikman. Today we're going to talk all about brown adipose tissue and ketosis and insulin, and how insulin promotes weight gain and fat tissue formation and so forth.
Yeah.
So Ben, it's really awesome to be with you.
Thanks, Mike. I'm thrilled to be here with you too.
So there's a lot of different angles that we can start with this, but I think the first kind of what got you into this research, you know, with your background and personal interest in exercise, is to talk about how insulin is really kind of a harbinger and causes weight gain, you know?
Yeah, it does. So I was an exercise enthusiast for years. My first 2 degrees are exercise physiology. I was interested in how the body responds to exercise. That meant I was fascinated by calories, or obsessed or fixated on the idea that when I was talking with clients when I was a personal trainer during my first graduate degree, it was always, you gotta eat less, exercise more. And I just saw this was not working, or it would work and then it would fail. It would work and then it would fail. And then it was during my PhD where I began to really appreciate that insulin is the key to metabolic function. As insulin goes, so too does body fat. And that was research I continued through my PhD, my postdoctoral fellowship, and now that I have my own lab, the focus has stayed on insulin and the relevance of insulin in normal metabolic health.
Right, and so insulin, when it becomes too out of balance, right? When individuals are having a lot of carbohydrates in their diet and so forth,
That's right.
It really expands, it causes adipogenesis.
Yep.
I mean, it's a key, one thing you talked about in a presentation with Jeffrey Gerber and so forth in Colorado was in order to grow fat cells in the lab from their stem cells, you need insulin,
That's
which
exactly
I think is
right.
really fascinating.
Yeah, you can't. Yeah, so you have these progenitor cells in a little dish, and then we have to spike in insulin at certain doses over a certain period of time in order for them to just become fat cells. And you'd mentioned the process adipogenesis, and that is that process where you're taking progenitor cells and turning them into adipocytes. But within the adipocyte, and what insulin is doing in any adult human, it's initiating a process called lipogenesis, which is the creation or the expansion of the lipid droplet, this big bulge of fat within the fat cell. And when you look at a fat cell under a microscope, you can't see the mitochondria, you can't see the nucleus or all the other parts of the cell, because they're shoved up against the sides, because the fat droplet, the main body, the fat body within the fat cell, is encompassing the entirety of the girth of the cell. And so insulin is both making new fat cells, adipogenesis, and creating the fat in the fat cell, lipogenesis. Mm-hmm. And you have to have it. Any scientist, any biochemist would nod their heads and say, yes, insulin is absolutely required. And yet, despite that being well established in any textbook, when we try to talk about the relevance of insulin in human obesity, all of a sudden there's some disconnect, and all of a sudden people say it's not relevant. Yeah. But it is.
Why do you think there is that disconnect? Is it politically motivated, or?
Oh boy, that's a great question. Yeah, so it's certainly our obsession with calories, calorie number, where we want to look at the human body as a perfectly closed thermodynamic system. And it is all energy in, energy out. If there's any mismatch, then the system is gaining or losing. And it's tempting to want to think that, right? It makes sense and you could mathematically write it all out. But we are more complicated than that. We are not a simple, sink with water coming in and water coming out. We have to account for hormones. So is it politically driven? Boy, it's tempting to speculate that there are ulterior motives in sort of culture, where there are people with a lot of money who don't want us to focus on what the calorie is doing and rather focus on number of calories.
Right. Very interesting stuff. So to kind of summarize, insulin does two really bad things, right? It causes your stem cells, which we all have some stem cells, right?
Yeah.
So if we're having a very high carbohydrate diet, we're inactive, we're mismanaging our stress, not getting sleep, all these factors that promote insulin resistance.
Yep.
Basically, our stem cells are being preferentially making more adipocytes.
Yeah.
That's insulin mediated.
That's right.
Problem number one. Problem number two is the fat cells that are being made are storing more lipid droplets within the cell. So they're becoming enlarged.
Yep.
And then they release more adipocytokines, leptin, all this fat and all that.
That's right. Yes,
nasty
all of them.
Stuff.
Yeah, that's right. So in the initial weight gain in a human will be entirely through lipogenesis. So if we all just started gaining weight right now because we're eating bagels and donuts and what have you, soda pop, our fat cells are just going to get big. Then once we get to around 150% of what is ideal, whatever that may be for our bodies, then we start making new fat cells. So that's not a process the body wants to do because it's expensive to make new cells. So you just work with what you've got. And so if insulin's telling the body, store energy, it's going to do that in the fat cell. The fat cells that we already have will get big. And so the flip of that is as someone starts to lose weight, they're not cutting their fat cell number. They're just taking all their fat cells and they're shrinking them as the fat within the fat cells starting to be shared by the body, used by the muscles or whatever.
Interesting. So we can actually lose the fat cells once they've been created. We're just making them smaller.
Yeah, it's going to be more often than not making them smaller.
Interesting. Or we can convert them, little hint to what we're going to talk about later, from the white adipose tissue to the beige, so beiging of that.
Yeah, that's right. We make them act differently.
Interesting. All right. I definitely want to get there, but
great.
I would love to address some of your earlier research on ceramides and sphingolipids. I think this is a topic that kind of gets confusing because if you look at like athletes and their muscle, and it has a lot of intramyocellular like lipid deposition within the muscle, and then we look at biopsy of a type 2 diabetic muscle, there's fat in the muscle too, and one's insulin resistant, one's insulin sensitive. So how do we parse this mentally?
Oh, that's a great question. So you'd mentioned ceramides and sphingolipids. That is one class of the many types of fat that we have in our bodies, in every cell. And then you were talking about athletes and diabetics having a lot of intramyocellular lipid. That's a fat called a glycerolipid, triglycerides.
Okay.
So they're two different types of lipid. I mean, it's all in the same family of fat. But what you were talking about is something known as the athlete's paradox, where early researchers were trying to implicate triglycerides, which is the typical storage form of fat in the body, as a cause of insulin resistance. And they're saying triglycerides are what's causing the insulin resistance because we have a type 2 diabetic, we pull a muscle biopsy from the leg, and lo and behold, there's a lot more triglyceride in that muscle than in a normal insulin-sensitive person. However, the paradox arose when a group, I think at University of Pittsburgh, found that in muscle of elite endurance athletes, they had just as much fat as the type 2 diabetics did in their muscle, and yet they're exquisitely insulin-sensitive. And that sort of led to this crumbling down of the idea that glycerolipids, triglycerides in particular, are not relevant to insulin resistance. And in fact, it is likely different lipids, like the sphingolipid, ceramide in particular, which is one of many. And we need ceramide. Every cell has to have it. The cell is designed to have it for a reason. If you try to get rid of ceramide out of any cells, like we've tried to do in mice experiments, they cannot live. It's lethal. So we have to have it. Just like we have to have insulin, we just want to keep it in a nice range.
Interesting. So if I heard you correctly, so the obese individuals, if you biopsy their muscle, it's more the ceramides and those inflammatory, not so much the triglycerides.
No, that's right. Triglycerides is inert. It really is just a way for the body to say, I have a lot of energy to store, I'm going to store it. And that in and of itself is not harmful. That's benign. But other lipids, like the sphingolipid ceramide, which can be accumulated as a result of inflammation. If I were to induce any sort of inflammatory state, I take you into the lab, I infuse some mild levels of an inflammatory protein like TNF-alpha or something, we could then, after a few hours, track the initiation of ceramides in various cells, including in muscle, which is the most insulin-sensitive tissue by mass. So when muscle becomes insulin resistant, essentially the body is insulin resistant because it's just so much of us.
Right. It really helps with that glucose disposal and all that.
Exactly. It's the biggest glucose sink.
Right. So that's why you like lifting weights. We're talking offline. That's your
method. Yeah, and that is one of the reasons. I'm an advocate of exercise. I always say we eat smart to be lean and we exercise to be fit or just healthy. And minute for minute, if you're going to pick your exercise, aerobic or resistance, boy, you go with resistance. And there's studies to show that on the low end of training, when people are training for many hours per week, on the low end of that, if it's a lot, 10 hours per week, there's not much difference. But the people who are training only 2 or 3 hours per week, resistance training works better at improving insulin sensitivity than endurance training, probably because you're expanding your muscle mass. And as you're doing it, you're more insulin sensitive because you're pulling in your glucose more readily at any moment of the day.
Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful tip. So going back to insulin and the ceramides and the sphingolipids a little bit, we hear about, you mentioned lipogenesis or de novo lipogenesis.
Yep.
Are some of these toxic, or again, in the right context, are healthy, too much or imbalance? Does insulin drive, I've read some research on that. You mentioned inflammation, but is insulin a factor there too?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, so I just had mentioned that inflammation is an inducer of ceramide biosynthesis, and then the ceramide starts to overaccumulate in the cell and create an insulin-resistant state. You can have no inflammation and just have hyperinsulinemia. So we published that about a year or two ago, that just insulin itself in higher than normal levels is going to it's going to activate the process whereby the cell starts to build up ceramide and thus create insulin resistance. And so it's this seeming paradox that too much insulin causes insulin resistance. But it is a fundamental feature of just biology. You take any cell and you give it too much of something, the cell will start to resist that stimulus. It'll say there's too much. I mean, why do we rotate our antibiotics? It's because the bacteria becomes resistant to this one antibiotic if it sees it all the time. And so an alcoholic needs more alcohol because they become resistant to that one glass of wine. Now they need 2.
Mm-hmm. Or why you need to, if you continue to lift weights, you need more and more weight to cause that same stimulus response.
That's right. You have to confuse the muscle in that case. Yeah, you can't. Adaptation is the kiss of death.
Right. Very interesting. So if we were to improve insulin sensitivity and so forth and reverse this deposition of these toxic lipids, is it just a function of more adaptation, more stimulus, more exercise?
Yeah, so exercise is helpful, no doubt, but it is all about the food we eat. You have to, and it's so powerful. You know, within 24 hours, someone can so fundamentally alter their hormone profile, in particular insulin, that they've immediately started shifting from a storage phase to a use phase, and that's really well established. You know, if insulin if their fasting insulin is above around like 7 or 8 nanomoles, which mind you most adults are above that, you're almost constantly in a state of storing. Even if you're sleeping, if your fasting insulin is above around 8, you're going to be storing fat, and then if your fasting insulin is below, then you're using it. You're mobilizing fat just because fat is the key. And then and same thing with ceramides, insulin resistance. It's all linked to, are you controlling your insulin by watching your macronutrients? That is the key. Yeah. You can't get around it. You can, if you're exercising like gangbusters, but you're eating a high starchy insulin spiking diet, no, you're going to be losing. Right. Losing as in you're going to be gaining weight.
Right. And that's, sometimes we see on TV, right, a lot of these athletes that are professional eating McDonald's and Subway and this, and it's just amazing that after they retire from their career, they tend to put on some weight, So, I think the stimulus exercise is essential. It's important, but food, kind of like you mentioned, trumps all that. So,
it does.
Going back to the toxic lipids and how they induce insulin resistance is really, I've read from your papers, kind of causing mitochondrial damage.
Yeah.
So
let's just to be fair, I don't want to say damage.
Okay.
I'll say that it's disrupting, or altering. I want to be a diplomatic scientist here. Yeah. So we found that when we induce ceramide accumulation in the muscles, that was forcing a state of mitochondrial fission, which is normal. So we normally look at the mitochondria as just this round little kind of kidney bean shape, but that's actually not really fair. More often than not, they are reticular. They're bound, stringy things. In fact, mitose, the origin of the word mitochondria, means thread, and that's suggestive of this fact that when you look at a mitochondria, when you stain them in a cell, you see these strings, and that's normal. They should go from that fusion state, where they're little strings, to a fission state, and then the cell will split, how the cell normally divides. And then for the cell to start growing again and working well, the mitochondria fuse again and then create that big, long, reticular, stringy structure. What we found is that when we had ceramide accumulating in the muscle cells in particular, it forced fission. It was forcing the mitochondria apart. And that sustained, forced state of mitochondrial fission resulted in increased oxidative stress, reduced production of ATP, which is the key function of the mitochondria, in part to produce ATP, which we need for any cell to work, including muscles to contract and relax. So overall, the metabolic profile changed, largely because of ceramide's effects on mitochondrial physiology or mitochondrial dynamics.
Interesting. So that cell just couldn't create its own energy at that point.
Yeah, it wasn't doing it as well. That's right.
Yeah.
We were sort of mucking up the gears in the nice, intricate mitochondrial machinery.
Interesting. And so another aspect of your research that you've been studying within the context of mitochondrial function is brown adipose tissue and this uncoupling protein. And I think that's a really, we hear about this uncoupling protein and all that, but let's kind of define that, and that will help us better understand the function of brown adipose tissue.
Yeah, so you'll let me know if I start to go a little too deep. You
Sure.
just bring me back. So we talk about a mitochondria as being coupled or uncoupled based on how well the mitochondria are moving protons and then creating ATP because of this shift of chemicals, this shift of charges, the protons moving around, changing the charge in the mitochondria, and then we produce ATP because of that. The more efficiently that's working, the more coupled the mitochondria is. And that's good in the case of like a muscle. We don't want a muscle to be wasting energy. We want it to just only pull in the fat and the glucose that it needs to create ATP. And then we use that ATP to contract the muscle and maintain normal muscle cell function. When a mitochondria is more uncoupled, then it's pulling in fat and glucose to create heat. It's no longer providing any functional work for the cell. And so we wouldn't want that happening at the muscle because now the muscles can't contract as well. But if it's something like the fat tissue, which is just hanging out anyway, then all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense where that fat, which is normally only storing the energy, it has the ability to flip a switch, kind of. In brown fat, this is happening, where it now can pull in fat or glucose and just create heat. So it's wasting energy, and in that sense, it's actually really inefficient, but it's wonderfully effective at providing a beneficial metabolic environment, a so-called metabolic advantage, where you can be, if you don't have to count every little calorie because you have a bit, your engine is kind of humming, it's motoring along at a slightly higher RPM. And so your metabolic rate is in fact higher than normal just because we're creating a little more heat. Mm-hmm. And all humans have some brown fat. We have a lot of it when we're little, which is, any parent could do this experiment. You take your little newborn and little child out of the bathtub, they don't shiver because they have a lot of brown fat in their body, and it is just humming along, producing a lot of heat. But as we grow up, we start to lose that brown fat, and then if we need to create heat, we shiver. And then that slight inefficiency of all those chemical reactions in the muscles creates enough heat that we warm up. But we all have brown fat, and we can activate it, and we can make white fat act more like brown fat, which is something you'd mentioned.
Yeah, I think that's this whole idea of like inducing brown adipose tissue, the beiging. I think, for a long time, I've been following that research, I don't know, since 2009 or so. It was all animal model and theoretical. Now we're seeing more and more human clinical studies coming out.
That's right.
But I think your work has helped us to better understand that not only like periodic cold stressors can help, but the metabolic milieu influences the differentiation or the conversion, which is awesome. So let's talk about insulin and brown fat. Yeah,
so insulin. So of the two fat types we have, white fat and brown fat. White fat certainly predominates. So when someone starts talking about body fat and the fat that you can pinch or jiggle, or the fat that we might have viscerally in that visceral space, the visceral fat, that's all white fat. And then we have throughout our thoracic cavity, we have little depots of brown fat. All human adults have various amounts of this. And then this brown fat is what's creating the heat. And using the glucose especially to create heat. So insulin doesn't like wasting energy. Insulin wants the body to store, and so it's going to make brown fat shut off. It's going to come to the brown fat, bind to insulin receptors, and tell the brown fat, slow down uncoupling, start acting more like white fat. So slow everything down. And sure enough, we found that when you have brown fat cells that are exposed to insulin, their metabolic rate will go down by about half.
Wow.
Now, in contrast, we have all the subcutaneous fat that I mentioned, the jiggly fat that's right beneath our skin, that has the capacity to act like brown fat, this process known as beiging, where it doesn't actually become brown fat, but it acts like it. And that means that its mitochondria, it can not only make more mitochondria, which is why brown fat is actually brown because of the sheer amount of mitochondria in it, but so it makes more mitochondria, and the mitochondria are more uncoupled. And insulin doesn't want to do that, but ketones will do that. So when ketones come to white fat, it starts to make white fat act more like brown fat. In other words, it tells the white fat, I don't need you to be storing right now. I want you to start wasting. And so the mitochondria in the white fat begins to be uncoupled.
That's very fascinating, but it seems to me that in a state of, if we think about like ketosis from a teleological evolutionary perspective of fasting, or periodic bouts of like no food, right? Hunter-gatherer days, why would the ketones induce like this almost wasting?
Yeah, I love that you asked that. As a scientist, one of the fun things is to try to pretend to be a philosopher. And as a scientist, we can only ever answer the question, how? How is it happening? And we can always get those answers. I know how a ketone is causing uncoupling. We know that chemical pathway. We've been discovering that here. Why? I can only speculate. So in the sense of wasting energy, there's no sense. If you're in a state where you're deficient, you're fasting, and the fact that ketones are causing this mitochondrial uncoupling, it defies reason. The counter, the way I can see some semblance of logic or wisdom behind that system working that way, is that often in human history, it probably would have been happening in a cold time. It's harder to find food to eat when it's cold, in winter. And so in that sense, the counter to why waste energy if you don't have the energy to waste, there's no good answer to that. But perhaps the flip side is you're going to stay warm, and it's actually going to let you survive because you are slightly more uncoupled and your engine is humming along at a slightly higher rate. That's the only way I have to explain it. And I've tried to find a good rationale for it because the body will act rationally. It's going to act to protect itself. That has to be what it is. It's that if there was a famine, it was likely happening in a colder time, where this nature is just less abundant. You're going to have a harder time finding something to eat, whether it be animal or plant.
Wow, that is you've really confirmed or helped to solidify in my mind this idea of like, because a lot of people are into this whole ketogenic thing, doing it all the time year round. But if we try to think back to eating seasonally, eating what's available, like we're filming this in August, we have a lot of berries and fruit and carbs. So it makes sense then that ketogenic would be more cyclical, seasonal aspect. And now with this new link between brown adipose tissue conversion or the quote unquote beiging, it makes a lot of sense. So I'm glad that you helped to wrap, because a lot of researchers that I talked to and clinicians have remarked about that it to be the healthy way to kind of go about this would be more of a seasonal consumption.
Yeah, and then mind you, even our other sort of omnivore siblings in animals that are omnivorous, many of them will hibernate, like a bear. What's interesting, it's quite telling that a bear, as it is approaching hibernation, of course it's eating whatever it can eat, including a lot of plant sources for food. It also becomes insulin resistant during those final few months of being alert. The body it shifts and becomes insulin resistant, which means its insulin is higher, which means it's storing fat much more readily. The moment it starts to wake up, what happens? Brown fat becomes active. And that actually is part of what raises the body temperature to bring them back to alertness. And this is much more obvious in smaller hibernating omnivores, where their bodies will start to kick into, and you can see on these little heat signature cameras, brown fat becomes active, and that starts to wake them up and keep them alive in winter, where the brown fat is what's humming their engine along, keeping them warm and keep them from freezing.
Wow, very fascinating.
So we might sort of that might be analogous, where it's not maybe an accident that the starchy foods are in season in the fall, we get ready for winter, and we uncouple throughout the winter to stay warm. Now, of course, we have circumvented that in our culture, because we're always in temperature-controlled environments. You could make the argument that we don't need to start storing that fat, which would mean we don't need to eat those starches. But if all of a sudden no more heating was allowed, in a place like Utah where it gets cold in the winter, then I would probably eat more starches in the fall. But because I'm going to be temperature-controlled all the time, I'll just keep the starches on the side.
Mm-hmm. And kind of induce the brown adipose tissue year round, right?
That's right.
Keep insulin very low.
That's right.
Yeah, very fascinating stuff. What about inducing cold thermogenesis? A lot of people are into like ice baths and cold showers.
And that works. No question. It works. It's just not fun. I remember living in Russia where we didn't have hot water for 4 months. And it wasn't fun, but I bet my brown fat was probably going along like gangbusters. So that, no question, the well-established human method in humans to activate brown fat is constant cold exposure. Now, someone listening might think, well, then I'm just going to go outside in the winter, but they're all bundled up, but this is actual genuine, you're sitting in a cold environment and you're shivering for an hour. I mean, that is not fun, but cold bath, ice baths, genuine cold exposure, yep, that'll do it. But
Periodic.
so also can just staying in ketosis.
Right. Now, is there a millimolar level of blood beta-hydroxybutyrate that you found is kind of key to help with this beiging?
Yeah,
or?
that's a great question. We don't know in humans yet.
Yeah.
And we can't use rodents as an acceptable model because inducing ketosis in a rodent is so different from humans. They just do not respond the same way. And despite me using rodents in research, I am a loud-spoken advocate of us being aware of the fact that while a rodent provides an interesting metabolic model that we can make some connections to humans, using a rodent model to try to gauge human nutrition is not at all active. For example, or accurate. You can give a rat a 90% fat diet, and they will barely be in ketosis. I mean, their ketone levels, they might not even be in ketosis. It's such a small blip. But you put a human on a 90% fat diet, they're in ketosis. I mean, they're going to be around 2 millimolar or plus. So the actual level of ketone you have to be in, we don't know yet. That's a study we're just starting.
Starting to look at. Okay, so this is mostly in animals, and just to kind of summarize again for people listening, it was mostly within the subcutaneous fat and visceral?
That's right.
Okay.
Yep, so the visceral fat, even in the animal models, the visceral fat, like the fat around the kidneys, would not shift. It would not start acting like brown fat. It was only the subcutaneous fat. Mm-hmm. Now, little rodents don't have a lot of subcutaneous fat. Humans have a lot. Most humans will store most of their fat in a subcutaneous depot, whether it's on the belly, the hips, or the backs of the arms, what have you. It's mostly subcutaneous. So when you look at the potential relevance in a human of making that subcutaneous fat, which is their biggest amount of fat, act like brown fat, there's a lot of, it's tempting to speculate that it really may become quite a substantial benefit, metabolically speaking.
Right. That's my next question. We hear a lot about our resting metabolic rate, and you shared a lot of research at Breckenridge, which was awesome. That video is available on YouTube. I'll put the link below that. Folks want to watch that. But we hear people saying like, "Oh, I have a sluggish metabolism."
Yeah.
And and one of the graphs that you showed was like an inverse correlation: higher insulin, lower your basal metabolic rate. Does brown adipose tissue contribute to one's overall metabolic rate?
Absolutely. Yeah. So some of the most seminal, I almost feel like I have to mention this because these scientists were just so incredible. Benedict and Joslin. Joslin, they named the diabetes center in Boston after him, but Joslin and Benedict were key at our understanding of how insulin regulates metabolic function. They found that in an untreated type 1 diabetic, so they're underdosing their insulin or no insulin at all, their metabolic rate would be really high. And they'd give them insulin, which they need to live, of course, to bring their ketones in check and their glucose in check, their metabolic rate would start to come down. And so we've seen this in humans. You infuse insulin into a human and metabolic rate will start to just shut down. And that's because insulin doesn't want to waste energy. It wants to store it. And so the relevance of all of this in a human is we can alter our metabolic rate to the tune of around 200 to 300 calories per day just by being in ketosis or not. And that is just doing nothing. And we've made that difference in metabolic rate. However, many people misunderstand metabolic rate, and they want to look at metabolic rate as just the end-all for their metabolic function. And you'll be talking to someone who's very unhealthy body weight, they're obese, and they'll say, oh, my metabolism is really slow. No. If you have a guy who's 250 pounds, my body size, 5'10", 250 pounds, his metabolic rate's going to be 20% or so higher than mine, just because more body means higher metabolic rate. And this 250-pound version of me, if he loses 100 pounds and gets to 150, his metabolic rate will go down. And so there's this idea that people are obsessed with metabolic rate, and I think it's part of our obsession with calorie counting. But in the end, the nice news is someone doesn't have to have an indirect calorimeter where they're breathing in and out and measuring their metabolic rate. We don't have to do that. You don't have to have a metabolic rate calculator. If you know you're controlling your insulin, done. And now the easiest way to know you're controlling your insulin is what are my ketones? Anyone can use that. We don't have a at-home method of measuring insulin. May it happen someday. It hasn't yet. We do have at-home methods of measuring ketones, which is going to be, if ketones are up, that means insulin's low. And that's why I personally am an advocate of ketones or ketosis, simply because insulin will be low. And if insulin is low, then metabolically speaking, you're going to be all right.
Interesting. So a lot of people get excited about ketosis for the ketones and all the signaling properties that they garner, But it sounds like from your perspective, you're really excited about just keeping insulin more low.
Yeah, so I came at it from that perspective. I consider myself an insulin guy. I'm an insulin scientist. And so when I was first learning about even learning what a ketogenic diet was, I didn't care about the ketogenic diet aspect of it. I cared that I know that if insulin is low, the liver's turning fat into ketones. That's fine and dandy. Yippee. I just cared that insulin was low, and that meant the gonads were working better, the blood vessels and the heart was working better, the brain, nerves were working better, the liver. All of these, there's evidence to show that in a low carb, an insulin-controlled state, the body gets better. And that is largely a function of low insulin, or insulin being in control. And like you said, the fact that ketones are also elevated in that state, in my progression as becoming familiar with ketones and now studying them actively in my lab, and as evidence that I genuinely appreciate them, it really came just because ketones in and of themselves are benefits. It's the icing on the low carb cake, the low carb icing on the low carb cake, where the benefit insulin is really controlling metabolic function. Ketosis is just making it that much better.
It's a side benefit.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful benefit, and
Sure.
especially in states where there's genuine like neurological disruption, like people with seizures and dementia. Boy, in that case, you want to be in ketosis because it is in fact improving your life demonstrably. For the average person who just wants to lose weight, certainly be in ketosis because you know your insulin's in control, but you don't really care as much about the ketones per se because you don't have an overall, unhealthy state that depends on it. But where you have dementia or cognitive disruption, we know ketones help the brain work better if you wean the brain off of glucose. So again, like you said, it's just a benefit.
Awesome. Beautifully said. I think that's a really fascinating point because so many people get hung up on two things. I do a lot of online coaching for individuals. They get hung up on what should my macros be, my calories, and what should my ketones be.
Yeah.
And so I think, you just help people understand, that it's, if you're in ketosis, your body has a little bit more fudge factor in a sense.
That's exactly right.
It's that metabolic advantage. I think that's a beautiful concept so that we're not constantly kind of tracking things and worrying about that. But one thing that kind of comes up, so there's some people on the internet that are saying, well, we don't always want insulin low. Insulin participates in various healthy factors like increasing glutathione and things like that. So what would your argument or counterpoint be to that?
Yeah, so we absolutely need insulin. No question. Even our conversation earlier about mitochondrial function, you have to have insulin for normal mitochondrial function. So I wouldn't try to dissuade someone of thinking that at all. I mean, if you don't have it, you will die. I mean, type 1 diabetes was a death sentence once upon a time. And now it's not because they can treat with insulin. So my counter is you have to have insulin in control, which means you are going to have bumps. No question. You eat any mixed macronutrient meal, even if it's pure meat, that protein and that fat, you're going to get an insulin bump. And it's natural. It helps the body work. And in a way, it helps the body know what to do with the energy that it eats. However, too much is a bad thing. And so you'd mentioned, just for example, glutathione. It's telling that while insulin can regulate glutathione, so too do ketones. And ketones increase glutathione and help glutathione peroxidase work better. And so, and someone may say, well, I need insulin to get anabolic. I want my muscles to get big. I need insulin for that. Yep, insulin helps. But if you're eating a ketogenic diet or low carb and you don't have those big insulin swings that a carb-adapted athlete does, you don't have to worry too much because you have other anabolic signals like growth hormone or other individual amino acids that are protecting the muscle and inducing growth. And so there are redundancies to make sure that we're doing what insulin would do. We have that system. There are redundancies to make sure that happens in a state when insulin isn't always going to be high. So yes, we absolutely have to have it. We just want to keep it in control. And that does mean there will be bumps. And that's good. It's healthy.
So if you're eating healthy, real food, you're going to have enough of an insulin variability that it's not super physiologically low.
No, that's
right. To where the adaptive response is. So it's still...
It's normal.
Yeah.
It's not pathologically low. Despite, I've been saying that we want to keep insulin low, we want to keep it basal, or we want to keep it normal. But in some people, their basal might be, 15 nanomole. I mean, that's way too high. We want to bring it back down.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of research emerging about time-restricted feeding and intermittent fasting as kind of an element to improve ketosis and affect insulin sensitivity. Is there any research that you found, at least in animal models, about that as being a therapeutic tool to cause the beiging of adipose tissue
so
too?
we're studying that right now.
Wow.
Yeah, so I love that you mentioned those two things separately, the way you brought this out. Time-restricted feeding and intermittent fasting. I actually consider them different things.
Cool.
And both of them can certainly be beneficial. With intermittent fasting, I think it can absolutely be wonderful and very therapeutic. The scientist in me worries a bit that it might be people aren't being careful with it, where they're going a little overboard, they're not monitoring ion consumption, and so intermittent fasting is something that I believe can be healthy, but I believe needs a lot of education. With time-restricted feeding, that's something that anyone can do, where you're taking all your meals, all your calories in the day, and you're simply compressing them to a 6-hour window. Nonetheless, the effect of that on uncoupling white fat and mitochondria and white fat, making them act more like brown or beiging them, I'll let you know.
Oh, that's so fascinating.
Yeah, it'll be a study where we have them in ketosis. We'll have a pure ketogenic diet group, an intermittent fasting group, and then a normal control standard American diet group. And we'll pull fat biopsies and we'll measure the uncoupling.
In humans?
In humans.
Oh my gosh, this is going to be a breakthrough.
Oh, it'll be great.
Yeah, because this is like converging all the different hot topics that we've learned in metabolic research in recent years. Very fascinating stuff. So what do you personally do when it comes to like your feeding window? It sounds like you're kind of on that time-restricted feeding.
Yeah, I am an advocate of that. And so for me, I've found that breakfast is, you can either chop off breakfast occasionally or dinner. And because I'm a family man and I consider being a husband and father priority number one, I don't want to not eat with my family. We're all sitting around the table and mom and the babies are eating and dad's just sitting there watching them eat.
Right.
I don't want to do that. It's just too awkward. So breakfast is the meal for me that is easy to do. And so about 3 times a week or so, no, I don't have a formula to it. I won't eat breakfast. And it's a piece. I'll usually have an herbal tea, and I sometimes will put a small tablespoon of coconut oil in or nothing at all, and it just stays a genuine fast, no calories. But I will drink an herbal tea. I just have a love for it, I guess. Yeah, routine, yeah. So that'll be about 3 days a week where I'll go right through breakfast, and then a big lunch, big dinner, and then maybe the next day I have breakfast. But when I do, it's not going to be starchy. All humans in the mornings have something called the dawn phenomenon. We're all a little insulin resistant in the morning. And so of all the times a day to eat some starchy bagel, don't do it for breakfast.
A lot of Americans and people throughout the world need to hear that, because if you go to Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts or any airport, it's bagels and orange juice.
That's
and
the
muffins.
starchy meal of the day. But we load it, starches on the front end, and that's the worst time to do it.
Yeah, scary stuff.
Yeah, of all the meals of the day, the fact that breakfast is the starchy one, and we're all a little insulin resistant, and that's normal too. We're all a little insulin resistant first thing in the morning because cortisol is spiking at that late time of night in order to mobilize glucose from the liver, feed the brain, and get the brain ready to start waking up.
Yeah.
But cortisol antagonizes insulin, which means we're all a little insulin resistant. The worst time to eat a bowl of cereal, a piece of toast, a bagel is right when we wake up. Yeah.
It's a shame that so many people make that their morning routine, which is a bummer. But going back to your morning routine with the herbal tea and the coconut oil, you said, I think there's a point I would like to expand a little bit on that for people listening now, because we hear about people want to know like what macronutrients will spike insulin and things like that. So pure fat, let's talk about how that doesn't really affect insulin and how that's more ketogenic. Yeah. Whereas the mixed meal can kind of kick you out of ketosis a little bit in that.
Yeah, that's right. So pure fat, mind you, which in the human diet does not happen often, will have little to no insulin effect. It's just a teeniest little blip, if anything at all. And so, fat is, the reason low carb, high fat is ketogenic is because you're not starving, you're getting sufficient calories, but because the insulin effect of the meals you are eating is so minimal, you're staying in ketosis almost all the time. But the moment you start to mix your macros a little bit, which isn't bad, but you bring in protein will have a more substantial insulin effect. And it may or may not boot someone out of ketosis, but if it does, it's pretty mild and you get back down into it pretty quickly. Depending on, now with carbohydrates, I'm not anti-carbohydrate. And I wouldn't want someone to even think that, but I am an advocate of being smart about it, carbohydrates represents a tremendously broad spectrum of foods, where you have, broccoli on one end, which has a very small insulin effect. And you have a bagel on the other one, which has like the biggest insulin effect on the planet. That's not fair to really lump them into the same macronutrient, but we have to, because that is the same class of food. So the sort of magic macro mix that will put someone in ketosis, that's going to depend on the person. Where the more insulin sensitive a person is, the more they can wiggle with that carbohydrate family of the macronutrients. The more insulin resistant they are, the less wiggle room they have, because the insulin sensitive person eats that bagel, let's say half a bagel, just to be a little more wise here.
Yeah.
There's an insulin spike and it comes right back down, maybe in like 30 or 45 minutes. It's gone up 5 or 6 times and it's come right back down. If you're insulin resistant, not only are you already probably having a higher fasting insulin level, but then you're going to have a huge spike. Insulin might go up 10 times and it'll stay elevated for 3 hours. And then what happens at 3 hours, even 2 to 3 hours, you eat again. And right when the insulin starts to come down, you've bumped it right back up. And so you're almost every waking moment of the day, you're in this pro-fat storage, hyperinsulinemic state. And you are never going to be able to lose weight. You can exercise, and you're still not going to come out of that.
Mm-hmm. Because insulin's telling the body to store.
That's right.
Right.
And it trumps everything, like we said earlier. Nothing can beat insulin. Nothing beats insulin. Glucagon, cortisol, those are want to be growth hormone. Those want to be fairly catabolic to most fat depots. Insulin will win.
Yeah.
Every time. You have insulin on one side of the tug of war. You have glucagon, growth hormone, epinephrine, other hormones on the other, trying to put insulin in its place. And that's going to be a fair fight. Insulin alone can match the other ones.
Interesting. Along those lines, I think it's wise to finish off a little bit with exogenous ketones and talk about the kind of seemingly antagonistic environment in one sense. So low insulin, the liver gets a message to make ketones.
Yep.
High insulin, that message gets suppressed. And then so people are having birthday cake or whatever, and then kind of trying to offset that with their exogenous ketones. So maybe let's start off with the physiology just quickly, and then why maybe that's not such a good idea.
Right. So you nailed it. You hit the nail on the head. Yeah. So insulin and ketones are opposites in the body, insofar as insulin is in control, and if insulin is subdued, ketogenesis is happening. We have disinhibited ketogenesis by having low insulin. The moment insulin comes up, we put the kibosh on that, and ketones plummet. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's human organism physiology. Exogenous ketones, I will preface my comments by saying there might be a therapeutic role for exogenous ketones in like traumatic brain injury or cognitive disrupted states like dementia, Alzheimer's disease. There might be some benefit to that, or seizures and stuff like that. However, it is also unnatural. We don't eat ketones. I mean, that's not something we get in nature. We don't eat ketones. We make them. We make beta-hydroxybutyrate. We make acetoacetate. We don't eat it. But now, because people have learned that ketones in and of themselves are beneficial, like we discussed, people are trying to have that shortcut and say, well, yeah, get into ketosis by drinking this. So when we drink a ketone, it will be turned, it'll come into the cell, it'll come into the mitochondria and be turned into a molecule called acetyl-CoA. And acetyl-CoA sits at the intersection of it can go a lot of different ways. When insulin is high, it'll activate an enzyme called acetyl-CoA carboxylase, and it starts taking that 2-carbon acetyl-CoA and it starts joining another acetyl-CoA and another and another and another, and it starts to create this long chain of carbons, which is a fat. And so I speculate, this hasn't been published, but if you had that scenario where someone is eating their birthday cake and thinking, but it's okay because I can just drink my ketones, and one finger prick or urine test or breath test, and I'm still in ketosis. You may be in ketosis, but you're going to be turning those ketones into fat in the mitochondria. I'm speculating, that research hasn't been done, but it makes all the biochemical sense in the world. If you're drinking a ketone, it will be turned into acetyl-CoA. It has to. That's how we use ketones for fuel. If insulin is high because of the birthday cake or whatever else starch or sugar the person's eating, you're going to turn that glass of ketones into belly fat.
Because insulin's there.
Because insulin is dictating what we do with those carbons. You wanted to use those carbons as ketones and use the ketone for fuel. You're now storing it. And you don't store ketones, you turn them into fat.
Or you can pee them out, but they have to be converted, yeah?
Yeah, but if insulin is high, you won't do that.
I see.
Yeah,
so that
you'll want to hold on to them.
Interesting.
Because the insulin will be thinking, wait, I'm taking in these carbons from the birthday cake and from the ketones. I'm not going to waste any of them.
Right. Yeah, it's a good opportunity to store for
That's
that rainy
right.
day that
And we
may
can't
never.
blame insulin for that. Thank heavens for it. As a species, we would have, we never would have made it if it weren't for insulin. So thank heavens we can store fat, and insulin can tell us to do that. But in that case, someone thinks they're beating their system, they're beating the body, they're tricking it. It doesn't
Not
work that
happening.
way. No, you can't trick that.
Yeah, you really helped me to kind of clarify something. I mean, we think about, like, we hear ketones and beta hydroxybutyrate, and we think we just kind of burn them, but they are converted to acetyl-CoA, and that's
right.
where energy really happens. And insulin will help to build more, link those together to make more fats.
That's right. That's lipogenesis. So just what we're doing in the fat cell, how insulin's activating lipogenesis, that process of turning acetyl-CoA into a fatty acid, that carbon chain, that is lipogenesis. And ketones can be fuel for lipogenesis if insulin tells it to.
Okay, so
but again, normally it never would.
Right.
Insulin should be low and then ketones high, and we wouldn't turn ketones into fat. But we're mucking up the system by having both elevated insulin and elevated ketones. An unnatural state resulting in an unnatural consequence, lipogenesis from ketones.
Right. So a better strategy for someone that's listening that may have done that or knows someone that does that would be maybe fast after or exercise. What would you suggest if they're going to?
Either, any of those. So fasting, without a doubt, is the most potent, quick way to get into ketosis. No doubt.
Yeah. Brilliant. All right. We covered so much. This was a lot of fun.
We did.
This is great. But we have 3 final questions that we ask every guest on the show, and a little bit more personal. We want to know your morning routine. So we know, like, successful, productive people that are really changing the world have a set of, like, routines and systems and habits that they do. So you mentioned you drink an herbal tea you like to in the morning.
I do. Yeah, that's just sort of, again, that is more habit than anything. I just found that when I'll wake up, usually between 5 and 6, closer to 5, and that kind of depends on my kids, mind you, as a busy family man. I'll wake up around 5, I'll make my herbal tea, and I'll get some work done. And when my kids will wake up, and I'll read, or I'll be working on a manuscript that I'm looking to get published, or something like that. So something very personally productive. And then around 6:30, 7, my kids will wake up. And my wife will come down, and I make breakfast. Breakfast is Dad's domain, and that's because it's something I really believe is important. And so my little kids are going to get ready for school. I want to make sure they have fat and protein in their bellies before they go out the door. And so I'll make some good low-carb, high-fat breakfast for the family. But it's almost always me. I want to be home for breakfast with my family. And then when the kids go to school, I'll usually come into work then. That's my typical morning routine.
Yeah, and we talked about, as an adult, sometimes you'll skip breakfast, but your kids are growing, so then just to qualify that a little bit.
So I may make bacon and eggs for them in the morning, and I may say, all right, this is for me a fasting morning. I'll make the bacon and eggs, they're eating, and I'm sitting around the island in the kitchen talking with them and talking about the day, planning out the day, and they don't even notice that Dad's not eating. It's not at all disruptive.
Yeah, great. That's really awesome. Let's talk about your favorite exercise. If there was one exercise you just couldn't live without, what would it be and why?
Yeah, you know what? I was a late adopter of Olympic lifts, as much to my shame. But if I had to only pick one, it would probably be a deadlift, which isn't a lot for a 150-pound, little svelte guy like me. But a deadlift, boy, I mean, from heel to head, you're going to get something on a deadlift. It's not necessarily my favorite. I sort of hate it, but if I had to pick one, that's the one I'd pick.
So you're activating so many different muscles at once.
You are, and it's such a practical movement.
Yeah.
You're just moving something up, you're lifting something up, working a lot, a lot of pushers and pullers are getting worked in that one predominantly pulling leg movement, but still you're going to get so much.
Yeah.
But if I had to pick one,
that'd be it.
I would reluctantly pick deadlift.
Yeah. Some people say squat or overhead press, but the deadlift, I too have a love-hate relationship. I mean, it's awesome, but it also, you can hurt your back if you're not doing
it's
things
taxing.
right. Yeah. All right. Your favorite herb, nutrient, or botanical. So you're stranded on a desert island. And the only supplements, vitamin D and omega-3s are covered. So just one thing that you can bring. It can be a whole food. It can be kimchi. It can be curcumin. What would you bring with you?
One food.
Yeah.
Liver.
Love it. Why?
I would probably pick cow liver if I could magically have it appear. Not because it's tasty, but boy, you're set. You're going to get everything you'd need. Frankly, it wouldn't be delicious, but if I had to pick, it'd be liver.
How do you cook it at home?
Yeah, I fry it.
Garlic.
Mind you, it's not popular in the house.
Yeah.
The stink of it and the taste. But so I don't live on a desert island. I don't eat it very often. But if I had to pick,
just for all the different micronutrients.
I would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a lot
butter
of
and garlic?
mitochondria in the liver?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that now we don't adopt the mitochondria of the meat that we eat, but we can get the components of it. We can get the building blocks of the mitochondria as we break down that mitochondria from any cell we're eating. And every cell has mitochondria except blood cells, red blood cells, I should say. So any tissue you're eating from an animal, muscle or anything, you're going to get mitochondria. And that's nice because we're getting the building blocks of their mitochondria, which we can use to build mitochondria or anything else.
That's brilliant. Brilliant. So if you were to be in an elevator with a politician or a parliament member from another country and they turned to you and said, Ben, I know you're studying metabolism, you're doing a lot of great research in your lab at BYU. What's something that maybe we as politicians and policymakers can influence policy around to help the masses?
What a question.
What's one thing that just says, boom, 30 seconds, how would you influence them?
I'd say let's shift the focus on carbohydrates and quit emphasizing a high carbohydrate diet. This experiment has failed. The results speak for themselves. Look at the world as we adopted a high carb, low fat diet, and look where it got us. So I would say let's please shift macros. Keep protein where it is, or let it come up as we eat more fat. But keep protein where it is. Bring carbs down. Bring fat up. Even if just a modest shift, where we're bringing our glucose, our carb consumption from 60% down to 30%, and raise the fat up to around 50%. Oh boy, you can get benefits from that. Is in fact the most common genuine Mediterranean diet, where we're just evening things out a little bit.
Yeah.
Lower carbs, higher fat.
Love it. Beautiful. Do you, as a kind of final question here, this does come up a lot in the ketogenic space, the worry of gluconeogenesis.
Yeah.
Do you worry with protein?
No. So with gluconeogenesis, of course, that's the process whereby the liver is going to create glucose when it feels like it needs to, which it absolutely needs to when you're low carb, high fat. It can do that from the carbons from proteins, which is an expensive process. The body doesn't want to have to do that because it'll take about 2 units, almost 2 grams of protein just to get 1 gram of glucose. That's expensive, especially where the protein's coming from muscle, and we had to work hard to get it. So, yep, you can get it from protein. You can also get it from the glycerol backbone of a triglyceride. As we're using our fat and mobilizing fat for energy, we have a glycerol, a carbon, small carbon chain, and then we have 3 fats. We pull off the fats to use in the mitochondria. We turn that glycerol, send it to the liver, and the liver will turn it into glucose. So, yeah, if mind you, most people do that without any problem.
Mm-hmm.
Overwhelmingly, someone goes low carb, high fat, even ketosis, ketogenic, and their fasting glucose is totally normal. It's because the liver is so darn good at gluconeogenesis. Right. And it will use protein to do that. Does that mean you have to raise your macros in protein? No. You only need to be more mindful of your protein if you're lifting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great point. Dr. Ben, it's been great to chat with you. We covered so many bases here. If folks want to connect with you online, what's the best resource? And I know you have a great website, Insulin IQ.
Right. So Insulin IQ website is where I put occasional blog posts there, and we have some resources just to help people adopt a low carb, high fat diet. But it really is in the context of insulin. You control insulin, you control metabolic function. I am also more recently passionate about sharing research, not even just my own, but I realize that science is very insular. The only people who know the research I'm doing, other than you, amazingly knowing anything about ceramides and mitochondrial dynamics, really it's just other scientists. We're the only ones who read each other's manuscripts. But I think it's such a shame because there are those of us who are studying metabolic function, and we know so much of the origins of obesity and the consequences of healthy or not healthy metabolic function. So I regularly will post articles that are just getting published all the time, real time, on Facebook, where just people can find me under Benjamin Bikman, or Instagram and Twitter at Ben Bikman PhD.
Perfect. I'll put that in the show notes. Yeah, you shared a wide range. At first, I thought it was all your research, but you're covering the gamut.
I just want people to know if there's a new paper that gets published, and every single day I scour the update. Mm-hmm. Any updates relevant to low carb, ketosis, insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance, I want people to know.
Yeah, that's awesome. The updates, do you use PubMed alerts or Google Scholar?
That's exactly it. PubMed alerts.
Yeah, I like that too. It's always nice. You wake up and you have all these from NCBI. You're like, oh,
yep,
cool.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Anyone can do it. It's so easy.
Totally.
The benefit is not everyone will have full access to the article, and being affiliated with the university, boy, I can get any of the details, which is just nice. Mm-hmm. It's just a perk.
Yeah, I've noticed some of the journals are being a little bit more less open about what, even if you go to a university, it's like, oh, sorry, this Nature, we do, Nature reviews endocrinology and metabolism, but not cancer, whatever.
Yeah, so journals will be specific. Some will be open access, which anyone can get, and I think that's a wonderful trend. And then many of the traditional and unfortunately awesome publications or journals are still closed, limited access.
Yeah. That's great. Well, you mentioned earlier that it's unfortunate that you do all this research, spend a lot of time, researchers in general, yet not too many people, unless the New York Times covers a piece, it doesn't get out there. But that's why I started this podcast, to help individuals better understand what's going on in the scientific world. And so I'm grateful for all the work that you're doing.
Well,
Very
ditto.
grateful for you coming on the show. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Mike. I enjoyed it.